Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with an episode of Cheap Shots, our series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we're going to show you how to cheaply paint a squad of Subjugator Enforcers for Games Workshop's Necromunda. We will be painting this squad in the colors inspired by the comic book series 2000 AD's Judge Dredd, and if you follow the tips, tricks, and techniques that we recommend, you could paint this entire squad for less than $23. You'll have a beautiful tabletop standard, and at the same time, when you compare it to the materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel, we'll be saving you over $127 at exactly the same time. So there you guys have it. This is what it's going to look like with this tabletop result. Let's talk about exactly how we're going to paint up these Subjugator Enforcers for your future games of Necromunda. Now the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble the bodies, and at the same time keep the assault shields off of the miniatures for now. You're going to do like a little bit of a sub-assembly. As you can see in this picture here, I got 4 guys who are going to have assault shields, while the other 2 guys will be carrying an assault ram as well as a concussion cannon, and I'm just doing that so that way I have ability to actually swap out those fighters later on if I want to. Now as for the assault shields, I recommend that you leave those off the miniatures, and the reason why is so that way you can paint easier in the bodies as well as the back of the shields, because it'd be extremely difficult for you to do it once those are glued on. So once you guys have your sub-assemblies made, next thing we need to do, of course, is a primer. So now that we have our miniatures assembled, the first thing we gotta do, of course, is to apply a primer. I like to use Rust-Oleum Flat Black Primer. This stuff costs $3.99 at my local Walmart, and I just spray this over the entirety of the miniature. Now, if you want to do exactly the same thing using Citadel, you have to use Chaos Black Spray, which costs $17, which is more than 5 times as much as Rust-Oleum Flat Black Primer, and does exactly the same thing. Now what priming does, it does a couple of things for your miniatures. The first thing it actually does, it actually gives a good surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to when you're applying them onto your miniature. If you're to take bare plastic and put acrylic paint on it, unfortunately there's not enough surface tension to keep that acrylic paint on there, so the slightest bit of friction will rub off the acrylic paint and it'll ruin the overall finish of your miniature, and that's where primer comes in. The second thing the primer also does, as well as actually has a huge impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you put on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the darker the color tone that you want to use for miniatures, the darker the primer. So for example, these guys, I'll be primarily focusing on dark colors, so I'll be using a black primer for these guys. But if I was going for more of a vibrant or colorful look, I'd probably go with a white primer. Now once, of course, you do your priming on both the assault shields as well as your miniatures, we're going to brighten up these miniatures by using some dry brushing. So the first thing we're going to do real quick is apply a fast dry brush of Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. The color equivalent to this from Games Workshop would be Slanesh Gray, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55. As you can see on this miniature already with my quick dry brushing, a lot of the details that we couldn't see from the black primer is now appearing on the miniature. Now what dry brushing does, it creates the illusion of depth on your miniatures by creating highlights on your miniatures as well. What ends up happening is when you dry brush a miniature, the pigments of paint actually adhere to the edge surfaces as well as raised surfaces in the miniature, and it creates that highlighting effect while keeping that darker color in the recesses. And because these guys are primarily wearing black uniforms, the black primer actually takes care of most of the painting for us. All we got to do is brighten up that black clothing so that way we can see the highlights as well as like things like folds in the fabric, the joints between the armor panels, that sort of thing. And once you guys are done with that real quick dry brush, we're going to apply one more highlight on top of it to make it a little bit more brighter. So once again, I'm applying one more dry brush layer on top of the gray dry brush that we did earlier with Folk Arts Pale Gray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. The color equivalent to this, of course, would be Ulthuan Gray by Citadel, which costs $4.55. And as you can see, I just do that once more with the dry brushing all over the entire of the miniature, and we can see a lot of the details that we couldn't see before with the gray as well as the black. Now the nice thing about the Folk Art is when we add our oil wash down, it's going to actually darken down the highlights that we did with our dry brushing and make it more black with a little bit of gray highlighting, just so we can see those edge details on the actual uniforms of these guys. Now I will admit there is a kind of a chalky pastel finish when you actually do dry brushing with the miniatures, but don't worry, when we do the oil wash, it's going to smooth out those transitions and that chalky appearance is going to go away as well. And now that we're done dry brushing most of these guys over with, most of the colors are done, now it's time for us to work on individual portions of their uniforms. Now the first color we're actually going to use real fast are 2 different colors, and I forgot to take the picture of me painting the guys in green, so I do apologize for that. What we're going to do is we're actually going to paint the arm greaves as well as some of the mag pouches these guys are wearing, as well as the shin guards and knee guards of these subjugators in 2 thin coats of Holly Branch, which is a nice rich Christmas green that's made by Apple Barrel Paint. Costs 50 cents. As you can see that I painted the different parts of the armor in that nice bold green color. And the reason why I did this is because if you look at the Judge Dredd characters from the 2000 AD comic books, on top of their black uniforms, they have like green looking armor on their arms and legs, and so I decided to do that as well because we are doing this in the Judge Dredd inspired paint scheme for those guys. At the same time, we're also going to pick out some of the leather goods these guys are wearing, things like their belts, mag pouches, as well as holsters, and we're going to pick those out in 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige with apple barrel paint. That costs 50 cents at my local Walmart as well. Now the Territorial Beige equivalent from Games Workshop would be Baylor Brown, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55, and the Games Workshop equivalent for Holly Branch would be Caliban Green, which is 9 times as much at $4.55 as well. And when we put down 2 thin layers of our green as well as our brown, next thing we do now is start working on some of the armor panels on the Subjugators. So as you can see in this photo, I applied the Holly Branch on the armor on the elbows as well as the chest armor that these guys are wearing to represent the fact that these Subjugators have upgraded armor for themselves because they deal more in close combat type situations than their Palanite counterparts do. And at the same time, I'm also pinning up some of the straps that are on the back of the knees as well as the elbows for these characters as well. And I decided to pick that out in English Ivy Green, which costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The equivalent to this from Games Workshop would be Vulcan Green, which costs $4.55. And the reason why we're doing this is so that way it looks like that the straps for the armor panels are added onto their black uniforms, and that's also add to that overall green look that we see in a lot of the Judge Dredd characters from the comic book from 2000 AD. Just put 2 thin layers of that English Ivy Green. It's a nice olive drab color, and then from there we're ready to work on our next set of dry brushing. So the parts that we did in green, we're actually going to put that out in a thin layer of lime sherbet that's made by Apple Barrel Paint, costs 50 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. And the color equivalent to this would be Cyberite Green by Games Workshop, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55. And as you can see on the shields, and now the reason, if you notice before, I have some Holly Branch on the shields. I'm actually going to change that color later on because I realized I didn't have enough red accents in those shields, so I'm not going to bring those up too much because I actually changed my mind in the middle of painting. But I do the dry brushing for things like the mag pouches, the armor panels that you see on a lot of these guys on the armor they're wearing on their legs, their arms, as well as their chests, as well as some of the mag pouches that they have too. Now for the guys that we did with the brown leather for their holsters as well as for the belts, we dry brushed that in a thin layer of Anita's acrylic taupe gray, which costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. The color equivalent to this from Games Workshop would be Rekarth Flesh, which is at $4.55. And once again, we're just creating those highlights by catching those pigments on the raised surfaces and ready to move on to our next set of details. And the next detail we're going to work on are on the red elements of these miniatures as well. Like I said, we're going for a Judge Dredd inspired paint job, and if you guys ever know about the Judge Dredd character, they wear these executioner cowl looking type helmets, which are bright red. So because I picked out 2 thin layers of Manila's acrylic true red, which costs you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, the color equivalent to this would be Mephiston Red, made by Games Workshop, which runs $4.55. I applied this all over the top of the helmets of the Subjugators as well as that armor panel piece in the front of the shields. When I was painting these guys up, I realized I didn't have any red planned out from those shields, and that's the reason why I painted that armor panel in red to kind of create that coherent look between the shield as well as the helmets these guys are wearing as well. Now I painted the entirety of the helmet red because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out the negative spaces on the helmet and actually put that out in black paint to make it look a little more streamlined, but I find it easier just to paint the entire accent color on the helmet first and then fill in the negative space with the darker color, because it's much easier to apply black on a red base coat than it is to apply red on a black base coat. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and actually start working on the shields that these guys are carrying as well. So as you can see, I have 6 assault shields on here, and the reason why is because I painted all of them up, so just in case I want to add these later on to the backs of my assault troops. Now for these colors, as you can see here, I use a variety of colors in order to create like little lights as well as diodes and control panels that you see actually on the actual shields behind them. So for example, those little screens that they have on their shields, I picked out 2 thin layers of Delta Serencoat's Mermaid Blue. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. The color equivalent would be Talazar Blue by Games Workshop to create that nice kind of windscreen type of look on the shields. At the same time, for the little bar of light that they have inside their shield as well, I picked out 2 thin layers of Apple Barrel's Wintergreen, which costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The Game Workshop equivalent would be Gauss Blaster Green, which runs $4.55, which is 9 times as much. And I just did that to kind of create a little bit of accent color to contrast with all the black that we're seeing on these shields. Now, as for the electro diodes, as well as little buttons and things that are scattered throughout, as well as some of the metallic elements, I used King's Gold as well as Anita's acrylic. King's Gold, of course, is made by Apple Barrel Paint. Get that for 50 cents at my local Walmart. The color equivalent to this for Games Workshop would be Averland Sunset at $4.55. So I put those on some of the buttons on the back of the shields, for example. I also use Gunmetal Gray for things like some of the grenades that you see located on the base of the shield as well. That's made by Folk Art. It costs 75 cents at my local Walmart. The color equivalent to that from Games Workshop would be Lead Belcher, which costs more than 10 times as much at $7.80. And those are the details I picked out with those colors on the back of the shields. Now, as for the fronts of the assault shields, I use that mermaid blue once again that we talked about earlier for the windscreens on the front of their shields, so that way they can see through it. Also wintergreen for some of the light diodes that we see on the top of the shields as well. And as for the metallic colors, I use Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, which costs 75 cents at my local Walmart. The color equivalences from Games Workshop would be Retributor Armor, which runs $7.80. And I just picked up all the gold elements on the front, so like the little center icon, some of the armor panels on the top and the bottom. I wanted to make it look like these are actually modeled after giant like shields from like badges that these guys would actually wear, so make it look like they're giant badges. That's why I use that gold color, because it looks also contrasts quite nicely with the rest of the fighters as well. And that pretty much makes up all the details we painted for the shields. So going back to my subjugators, as you can see, I picked out the rest of the helmet in the negative space on top of the helmet in 2 thin layers of pavement paint, which is made by Apple Barrel. Costs 50 cents on my local Walmart. The color code would be Eshin Gray, made by Games Workshop, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55. So as you can see, that I have some red detailing on the helmet as well as black as well, so it matches the rest of the uniform, and it looks quite nice. It adds a little bit of contrast to the rest of the uniforms as well. And whether you're aware of it or not, we're actually done with the majority of the paint job on these guys. So with that being said, we move on to the metallic colors. So once again, we're focusing on the metallic colors for these miniatures. Once again, I'm using Deco Art for some of the gold elements, things like the little icons in the middle of their chests, as well as the lines on their shoulder pads, just to kind of create those little details that you couldn't see before. I also put a thin strip of gold on the top rim of the helmet as well, to kind of mark them out as being a little bit in a more superior position to their normal Palanite Enforcer counterparts as well. At the same time, I also used gunmetal gray for all the parts for the barrels, the guns, and magazines as well. I used some accent colors of copper by Folk Art, which costs 75 cents at my local Walmart. The color equivalent to that would be Screaming Bell, made by Games Workshop, which costs over 10 times as much at $7.80. That copper color I use are things like the grenades on the chest of the captain, for example, the little energy cells on the assault ram, as well as the concussion cannon the guys are carrying. At the same time, I also picked out some details in Folk Art Copper as well, things like the little ventilation pieces of the masks that these guys are wearing, for example, as well as some little iconography spread throughout. The Anita's acrylic antique copper equivalent would be Brass Scorpion, which made by Games Workshop, which runs $7.80 for that. And of course, just a quick dry brushing on the gold elements with Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. That costs 75 cents at my local Walmart. The Games Workshop equivalent would be Ironbreaker, which is $7.80 for that. And once you pick out all those metallic elements that you want painted, next thing we need to do now is start working on some of the last final details before our oil wash. So the next thing, of course, were the little bit of the finer details. I used 3 colors for the fine details on these miniatures. For the guys' helmets, for their eye lenses for their helmets, I picked out 2 thin layers of King's Gold, just so it contrasts nicely against the black. At the same time, you can see their eyes make it look like they're kind of glowing in the darkness. And as for the other 2 colors, I used Wintergreen as well as Mermaid Blue for some of the weapons that these guys are carrying. So some of these guys, like on the Assault Ram, as well as the Concussion Cannon, they have some power coils on those weapons. I picked those out in Wintergreen as well as in Mermaid Blue, just so they make it look like a little bit more high tech, and it contrasts nicely for the black and green and metallic elements of the uniforms these guys are carrying. So now that we're done with those fine details, next thing we need to work on is on the bases. So for the bases on this one, now what I do is, of course, I fully assemble the miniatures by putting the assault shields directly and gluing them down to the arms of the guys who will be carrying them. As you can see, it looks really cool, all fully assembled together, and it was much easier to paint by doing the sub-assembly. And then what I do is I paint the texturing of the bases in 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art, so that way I'm going to create this kind of rusted, kind of oily, slick, rundown kind of metal decking that these guys are walking around on. So of course, just put the 2 thin layers of Folk Art, and next we're going to do is a dry brush. So once again, I'm going to dry brush the bases with Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel Paint. This is a nice bright orange color that also does a beautiful job looking like rust on top of the metal these guys are walking around on. I know a lot of people like to use rust pigments and everything else to create this effect, but really if you're trying to save money, all you really need is a bright orange paint and just dry brush directly on the metallic elements, and it's going to look like that it's rusty. Now the color equivalent to this would be Luganeth Orange, made by Games Workshop, which costs 9 times as much at $4.55. Once you're done dry brushing the orange on the metallic elements to create the metallic and rusted look that you're looking for, last thing you got to do now is your oil wash. Alright, so the next step we're going to do now is an oil wash. Now, oil washing, for most people, when they do a quick paint method like this, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone. And Army Painter Strong Tone does exactly as it advertises. It does a beautiful job. The only problem is it costs $32 a can, which could be quite expensive in order to use that product. For me, I find that the cheaper alternative to use is Midwax Poly Shade and Mission Oak Color. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for $6.99, which is almost 5 times less than the Army Painter Strong Tone, and it does pretty much exactly the same thing. Now, what the oil washing actually does, it does does a couple of things. The darker oil wash, first of all, seeps into the recesses of the miniatures and brings a lot of the details that we couldn't see earlier. Things like folds in the fabric, for example, the gaps between the armor panels, the texturing of the metal decking these guys are working on, the textures on their weapons, etc. So those oil washes does bring out those recessed details. The second thing that the oil wash also does is that it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coats. As you notice in this picture, the chalky kind of pastel appearance that we had earlier is now gone. It's because it smoothed out the different layers of color and smoothed out the transitions to make them look like it's one thing, which is absolutely really nice. And the third thing that the oil wash actually does, it actually mutes down the vibrancy of our colors by darkening down the tone of the colors. As you can see, the bright, vibrant colors that we had before are much more muted now because we have that darker color, and that's exactly what the oil wash does. That's the reason why we use such bright colors in the earlier stages of the painting, because I knew that the oil wash was going to darken down those colors quite significantly. Now, when it comes to mid-wax poly shade, just like with Army Painter Strong Tone, there is polyurethane inside of the stain. And what that means is that when these dry and cure, you're gonna have a nice hardened exterior coating protecting your miniatures from fading, from being chipped, that sort of thing as well. Now, it does mean that you have to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure because of that. So if you do handle these miniatures while they're still tacky and not dried all the way, you could ruin the finish of your miniatures, so do keep that in mind. My suggestion to you actually is to make this the very last stage of your painting, and then of course just wait for 24 hours, then come back to it and pick off where you left off. And that's exactly what I would use for your mid-wax poly shades. And the second to last thing we're going to do, of course, is to rim the bases of the miniatures. In this case, I like to use Folk Art Skyline. It costs 75 cents at my local Walmart. That's a nice grayish blue color that I use for all the miniatures in the Necromunda collection for the studio. The color equivalent to this would be Rust Gray by Games Workshop, which costs $4.55. And once you get done applying your two thin layers of Skyline, we're ready to move on to our matte spray varnish. Now, this next step, of course, is completely optional, so I did leave this off the shopping list just in case you don't want to do this. Unfortunately, when you use polyurethane like this, it does have a high gloss sheen on the protective coating. I like to have more of a matte finish for mine, so what I use Krylon Matte Varnish Spray. It costs $5.99 at my local Walmart. I know some people like to have that high gloss finish, so you could skip this step if you want to, but if you want to do exactly the same thing like I did, you have to buy a can of Unitarian Varnish, which costs $17.50. And once you're done with that spray varnish, we are now completely done with our miniatures. And once again, this is the end result that we saw earlier. We have a beautiful tabletop finish by using some really cheap materials that are available at your local Walmart and other hobby stores as well by using cheap calf paints. It only costs us $22.08 if you want to paint up your miniatures exactly the same thing we did using our Cheapskate method. Now what we're going to do real quick is we're going to go through the shopping list that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you wanted to achieve the exact same results we did, except by using those name brand products instead of the cheap materials that we use for this video. So first of all, you'll need to buy a can of Chaos Black Spray, which costs $17, as well as Everland Sunset, Vulcan Green, Caliban Green, Cyberite Green, as well as Ballard Brown, Slaanesh Gray, and Eshin Gray, and Gauss Blaster Green. All those colors cost you $14.55, while the Chaos Black Spray costs you $17. Next thing you need to do is buy a jar of Talisar Blue, which runs $7.80, as well as Mephiston Red and Radcar Flesh, those costing $4.55. From there, you'll need to buy Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, as well as Ironbreaker. Each of those costs $7.80 a piece, followed up by Rust Gray, Ulthuan Gray, which costs $4.55, as well as Retributor Armor, which costs $7.80, and Army Painter Strong Tone, which is another $32. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything on the shopping list for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $150.40. And when you compare that with the Cheapskate method, which only costs $20.08, you're talking about a grand total savings of $127.60. Which could buy you quite a bit of miniatures, all things considered. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up a squad of Palanite Subjugators for your games of Necromunda. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good of this week, guys. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay classy.